Yeah, I think it's really important. If we think about randomized controlled trials, they're done to show obviously efficacy and safety in very controlled conditions. So there's the inclusion and exclusion criteria, which patients need to be eligible for. And many times, patients that we see in clinical practice wouldn't fit into that very controlled box. And so real world studies like Profundus help us understand what could happen in everyday practice where we take a broad range of patients. Those patients, we see patients with different comorbidities. They may have variable steroid tapering regimens, a broad spectrum of treatment histories. And it really reflects the complexity of the patients that we see in day to day clinical practice and at the bedside. And so when we complement those findings from the randomized controlled trials with real world evidence, if we see that the response rates and remission rates that we're seeing in the clinical trials hold up in the real world in these complex settings, it gives us a lot more confidence that the trial results are valid and then they can be translated into our clinical practice. Plus, it gives us that experience in those patients that are not necessarily included in the clinical trials. Well, they're extremely meaningful. When we think about when we treat patients, our treatment goals may be a little different between, say, patients and physicians. For physicians, we're looking for a lot of objective findings that we have disease control. But for patients, the way they live their day to day lives is through their symptoms. And so, what's particularly encouraging in Profundus is that we are seeing these high rates of clinical response and clinical remission. Over 81% of patients had a clinical response, and 72% of the patients were in clinical remission at week 26. And this is particularly important because this allows our patients to get back onto their daily life, whether it's being a mother, a student, somebody who needs to go to work. And the other important thing about the results in the real world is these results were very, very consistent across the patient population that was observed in this study. And it didn't matter whether the patients were treated with advanced therapies or not in the past. The other thing is that about 64% of the patients who were on steroids at baseline achieved this clinical response while they were discontinuing steroids by week 26, which we reported. And we know that this is particularly important because a lot of patients don't like taking steroids. B, we know that steroids can be associated with significant side effects even in the short term. So this steroid sparing property that we've seen within the real world is extremely encouraging. And once again, we can see this across varying patient types. Yeah, it's extremely important. So many of the audience know that there's different labels around the world with respect to the use of upadacitinib in ulcerative colitis. In many parts of the world, it can be used as a first line therapy. So seeing the data being consistent in patients who are bio naive or advanced therapy naive versus those that are not is very, very important because it helps us position the therapy when you can use it in earlier lines of therapy. In the United States, there's been a recent label change for it was restricted to patients who had been exposed to anti-TNF therapy. Now, clinicians can consider this in patients who've been exposed to systemic therapy, and that's open for interpretation. So, this data from the real world studies just again allows physicians to be very confident that they can position upadacitinib in different patient populations. One of the things that we always struggle with in ulcerative colitis is patients who are either steroid refractory, meaning they're on steroids and they're not improving, or they're steroid dependent, meaning the steroids work for them, but they just can't get off the steroids. And you can get into this vicious circle with individual patients where they have this sort of up and down course. They're experiencing the side effects from this steroids. There's uncertainty when they're coming off steroids. So this data is particularly meaningful for several reasons. Number one, in the randomized control trials, we saw that patients got better very, very quickly. So we know that we can introduce upadacitinib into these patients and potentially wean their steroids uh, quite quickly over shorter periods of time. And this really plays out within this real world study, because what I think is happening here is uh, individual clinicians are taking the data from the randomized controlled trials, and they're translating it into practice. So they're trying to taper those steroids quickly because they have confidence from the randomized control trial, and that's why we're seeing the results that are showed within Profundus. Yeah. Broadly, when we think about JAK inhibition, there were some signals with the first generation JAKs that maybe dissuaded the uptake that we would probably associate with the efficacy that we see within the class of drug. Now, with upadacitinib and the use, I think clinicians are getting more comfortable with the safety profile. Specific to Profundus, about half of the patients had some type of adverse event, but serious adverse events really only happened in less than 6% of the population, with the vast majority of those adverse events not being related to the study drug, according to the investigator. So I think the safety profile that we're seeing here within Profundus doesn't unmask any new safety concerns. A lot of the safety signals that we saw was related to the disease itself more than anything else. And this, combined with using a drug once daily as an oral, can make it a practical option for patients who need effective long-term management of the disease. So this builds on the extensive data that we now have across immune-mediated diseases, that this is a highly effective, well-tolerated, and safe medication in our patients with ulcerative colitis. The one thing that I do want to say in general about upadacitinib is that one of the I think hallmarks of the drug is its ability to control the symptoms that matter the most to patients. And in ulcerative colitis, it's that abdominal pain, urgency, rectal bleeding. And we saw that almost over 70% of the patients could actually have these symptoms resolved in a very, very sort of timely fashion. So 70% of the patients were really free of these symptoms by week 26. And once again, I think that this was associated with improvements in their quality of life, which we would expect, which which I think differentiates it a little bit from a lot of the other drugs that we've been using in moderate to severe ulcerative colitis. I think what we're looking forward to is, as this data set matures, meaning that we can have readout in a greater proportion of patients for longer term, that it's just going to bolster the confidence in the prescribing community of the value of this drug in moderate to severe ulcerative colitis.